The hall of the great academy was bright with crystal light that hung from the high ceiling. The walls shimmered with quiet patterns of blue and silver, and rows of young minds from a dozen different worlds filled the wide chamber, their eyes fixed on the elder professor who stood at the center, his robe flowing like the tide of a deep sea. It was a place of learning older than many kingdoms, a hall where wisdom from across the galaxy was shared, and where the brightest of every species came to sit together, listening, speaking, and questioning. And in that place silence carried power, for even the smallest word could turn into a story that lasted a lifetime. The professor raised his long hand, his skin scaled with the shimmer of his people, and his voice rolled like thunder wrapped in velvet. He asked a question that seemed at first so simple that many in the room smiled, yet within a breath the weight of the words sank like stone into water, and all felt the ripple in their bones. He asked, "Tell me, students, of the most dangerous extinct species that has ever lived on your world." The room filled with sudden life. Voices rose and laughter echoed. The students of the avian kind flapped their bright wings and spoke of sky hunters that once cut through clouds like knives, their beaks sharp, their talons sharper, and though those beasts were gone, the memory of them lived in story and song, and every feathered student puffed with pride as they told of battles fought above the winds. The scaled students from the desert world hissed as they spoke of titans that once walked their endless sands, creatures with jaws wider than a house and tails that swept away armies. They painted the picture of a world that trembled under the weight of steppes now long gone, and their words carried both fear and nostalgia, for their people had survived by wit and by tooth. From the ocean people came tales of shadow beasts that moved in dark trenches, hunters of silence, larger than any vessel, with eyes that glowed and teeth that gleamed like silver knives. The watery students clicked and sang as they described the horror of those vanished lords of the sea, and the air shimmered with their song, chilling the bones of land-born students who had never seen such darkness. Each voice carried into another, each story of a beast greater, stronger, and more fearsome, until the hall was alive with sound, a storm of memory and pride. The professor allowed it, for such noise was the heartbeat of learning. But as the storm reached its peak, he lifted his hand again, and all voices dropped like stones in a well. His eyes, old and sharp, turned across the room, and then they settled on one figure sitting near the edge of the hall, a figure small compared to the others, dressed in the simple uniform of the academy. And though many had forgotten him in the storm of stories, now every gaze followed the professor's eyes, and they all saw the human. He sat still, his face calm, his hands folded, his eyes carrying a shadow that others did not see. He had listened without word. He had not joined in the laughter, and he had not shared a story, for his silence was heavy and strange, and it made the others wonder if perhaps his kind had nothing to tell. The professor's voice softened but carried weight, and he said, "You, human, tell us, what is the most dangerous extinct species that has ever lived on your world? Tell us what your people fear from the past." The hall turned to stone, no breath, no whisper, no movement. Every alien waited for the answer, curious and amused, for in their eyes the human seemed small and fragile, his bones thinner than the scaled, his muscles weaker than the beasts, his voice quiet compared to the singers. And they thought, what could such a soft species fear? What ancient monster could matter to a world like his? The silence stretched and grew, so long that even the lights above seemed dimmer, so long that the sound of a single shifting foot echoed like thunder. And still the human did not speak. Instead he looked at the professor, his eyes dark and steady, and then he looked at the room, at the feathers, the scales, the shells, the glowing eyes, and he took in the sea of curious faces, all waiting, all leaning forward. When at last he opened his mouth, No one expected the words that would follow. No one expected the calm tone that carried more weight than any roar. And no one expected the answer that would fall upon them like a blade made of shadow. For in that moment the question that seemed so simple became the question that stopped the room, and the silence was deeper than any ocean, thicker than any fog, and sharper than any knife of war. The silence hung like a thick curtain over the hall, heavy enough to press upon every chest. The professor did not move. The students did not move. And the human sat still, his eyes carrying a shadow that seemed older than the academy itself. The question was simple. The answer should have been a beast, a monster, a creature of tooth or claw. But when the human finally spoke, his words came soft and plain, yet sharp enough to cut through every layer of noise and thought. He said, "Our most dangerous extinct species is us." At first the words fell like dry leaves into still water, barely a ripple, for the students could not understand. Their minds turned and twisted, seeking meaning in the strange answer. And then, like a sudden wind, the hall filled with sound. Voices rose in confusion, and laughter in disbelief. Some leaned to their neighbors and whispered. Some shook their heads and chuckled. Others hissed with sharp tongues. And a few even clapped as if the human had made a clever joke. But the human did not smile, he did not laugh. His face was calm, too calm, and the weight in his eyes grew heavier with each second. The professor lifted his hand again. The storm of voices broke and dropped. Silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence was restless. This silence was sharp. Every student leaned forward now, and even the glowing lights above seemed to lean closer, as if the academy itself hungered for the explanation that had to follow. The professor's voice was quiet, yet filled the room like a deep drum. He said, "Explain, human. Explain why your answer is not a beast, but your own kind. Speak so all may understand." And in that moment every eye in the hall locked on the lone figure waiting. The human took a slow breath. His shoulders rose and fell. And then he began. His voice was steady, almost gentle, yet each word carried weight. He said, "On Earth we had predators, great cats, giant bears, winged hunters, and beasts of the deep sea. But none of them came close to the danger that we created ourselves. The most dangerous creature we ever faced was our own reflection, for we learned to build, we learned to fight, and we learned to kill each other in ways no beast could ever match." The words slid into the room like ice. Many students frowned. Some laughed again, but more softly, uncertain, and others shivered though no wind touched them. For the human spoke not with pride, but with sorrow, as if each word was carved from memory, carved from pain. He continued, "Long before we reached the stars, long before we joined this academy, humans fought one another across the soil of our own world. We built weapons that did not hunt animals. They hunted people. We made fire that could burn entire cities. We made gas that choked the breath of thousands. We made machines that flew above the sky and dropped death from clouds. And when those were not enough, we built weapons that could turn night into day, weapons that could make a single blast, destroy a land larger than any beast could walk." A murmur ran through the hall. The feathered students ruffled their wings in unease. The scaled ones curled their tails closer. The water-born students shifted in their seats, their gills flaring, for in their worlds battles were rare and fought with honor, never with such tools of ruin, and never with such endless hunger for destruction. The human's eyes moved slowly across the room, meeting their gazes one by one, and he said, "We feared our beasts, yes, but our beasts only hunted when they needed food. They killed to live, but humans killed for reasons smaller, weaker, reasons of land, of pride, of anger, sometimes for nothing at all. And so we became the monster. The most dangerous species that ever walked Earth was not the lion or the bear or the serpent of the sea. It was the human itself." The hall trembled with silence again, a silence that now felt alive, as if the walls themselves held breath. The students who had laughed no longer laughed. The ones who had whispered no longer whispered. Even the professor stood still, his scaled hand frozen against his robe, his eyes fixed on the human as though staring into a storm. The human's voice did not rise, it remained calm, but the calmness made the words heavier. He said, We called ourselves civilized. We built cities. We wrote songs. We painted beauty upon walls. But under it all, we were predators to ourselves. And for centuries, we let that hunger rule. Wars covered our history like fire across a dry field. Each war greater than the last. Each one more destructive. Until at last we created weapons that could erase not just armies, but entire nations. And then we stood on the edge of our own extinction. A gasp echoed from a corner of the hall. One student could not hide his shock, for in his world extinction was spoken only in whispers, reserved for natural disaster, never for self-destruction, never by choice. And yet here sat a human who spoke of his kind walking willingly to the edge of their own end. The professor finally spoke, his voice low, his words slow. He asked, "And yet you sit here, human. Your people live. Your world lives. If your kind was the monster, how did the monster die?" The human looked down for a moment, then looked up, and his eyes seemed older than his face. He said, "The monster died when we learned, when we saw too much death, when we realized that if we did not change, there would be nothing left. We killed the monster not with weapons, but with choice, with unity, with the will to turn away from the fire. We buried the old self and tried to become something new. But make no mistake, the monster is never gone. It sleeps, it waits, and if pushed hard enough, it can wake again." The words fell heavy, heavier than any story of beasts, heavier than any tale of claws or wings or teeth. The students sat frozen, their bodies tight, their eyes wide, and the professor himself leaned back slowly, his face shadowed by thought. For the answer was not only strange, it was terrifying. The human ended with silence. He did not push his words. He did not beg belief. He simply left them in the air, sharp and real, and let them sink into the hearts of those who listened. And in that silence every alien in the hall realized that the human had given them not a story of the past, but a warning for the future. And though the question had been about extinct species, the answer had turned into something far more, a revelation of what humans once were, and what they still might be. The hall felt colder now, though no breeze entered the wide chamber and no window was open to the sky. The light from the crystal lamps above still shimmered, but their glow seemed pale, almost weak, as if the very building leaned away from the words that had been spoken. The students sat without movement. The professor stood like stone, and all eyes were still locked on the lone human who had turned a question of beasts into a mirror of horror. The professor lowered his head, his scaled fingers brushing across the folds of his robe, and he asked with a voice heavy with curiosity and unease, "Tell us more, human. Tell us of these wars you speak of, for it seems to me that your kind has lived not in the shadow of beasts, but in the shadow of itself. Let us hear what made your species the most dangerous of all." The human nodded slowly, his eyes carrying the weight of centuries, though his years were far fewer. He drew a long breath and spoke again, his voice quiet yet filling the room like water spilling into a silent cave. He said, "Our wars began small, tribes fighting tribes with stone and with fire, men and women who raised sticks and spears against neighbors for land or food. Yet even then the seeds of something darker grew, for humans did not fight to survive alone. They fought for pride, for power, for reasons beyond the hunger of the body. They fought for the hunger of the heart." A rustle passed through the feathered students, their wings shifting with unease, for to fight beyond need was strange to them. In the skies, battles were only ever about territory to nest or food to eat, never for pride, never for the simple claim of being greater. Their minds could not wrap around such a cause, yet they listened, unable to turn away. The human continued, "As our tribes grew into villages and our villages grew into kingdoms, so too did our wars grow. Stone turned to bronze, bronze turned to iron, iron turned to steel, each weapon sharper, each shield stronger. And with every change our wars burned hotter. Men marched in lines with blades, horses carried riders who cut through crowds, rivers ran red, cities burned, and still we fought, never asking why, never stopping long enough to see the ground beneath us turning to ash." The scaled students hissed softly, their tails twitching with discomfort, for in their desert's battles had always been swift, fought and ended within a day. never dragging for years, never carried by generations. Yet here they heard of humans who fought war after war without end, and it made their scales crawl. The human's eyes darkened as he spoke further. He said, "We learned to organize our wars. We built armies. We built strategies. We trained from childhood. We turned war into art and science, and our leaders wrote books on how to kill better, how to kill faster, how to kill more, until entire nations shaped themselves around the idea of battle. Children grew up not asking if they would fight, but when, and the drums of war were louder than the songs of peace." Gasps slipped through the hall. The water-born students pressed their webbed hands against their chests, their gills quivering, for to them war was shameful, a last resort when diplomacy drowned. Yet here was a people who had made war into knowledge, war into culture, war into pride, and the thought of it churned their stomachs like storm waves. The human did not pause. His words flowed like a river too strong to dam. He said, "But it did not end there, for as the centuries passed we grew clever. We discovered fire locked in powder, black dust that could roar like thunder. We filled tubes with it. We hurled metal through the air, and suddenly a man with a simple tool could kill from a distance. He no longer needed to look into the eyes of the one he killed. He no longer needed strength. He only needed powder and spark. And the killing grew faster, and the wars grew bloodier." The alien students stiffened, for in their worlds combat was face to face, blade against claw, honor against honor. The idea of killing without even touching the foe was chilling, yet the human spoke of it as part of history, not fiction. He pressed on. "We built cannons that could shatter walls, rifles that could fire again and again, ships that carried dozens of guns, and then machines that rolled on land with iron skins, spitting fire like dragons, and above the machines that flew in the sky, dropping death on those below. Our wars became storms that swallowed nations. Millions marched, millions died, and the earth shook with our fury." The professor's eyes narrowed, his scaled brow heavy. He asked softly, "Millions, human? Did you say millions?" The human nodded, his face grave. "Yes, millions. There was a time we fought a war so vast that every corner of our world was touched, a war where cities turned to rubble, where skies were black with smoke for years, where children starved while soldiers marched, and in the end entire generations were lost, gone to the soil. And yet even then we learned little, for soon after we fought again, each war greater, each weapon darker." The hall trembled with silence again. Students stared with wide eyes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered prayers in their own tongues, for to them such destruction was madness beyond reason. Yet the human told it not as tale, but as truth. He went on. "The greatest horror came when we split the atom, when we learned to turn the smallest part of matter into fire brighter than the sun. We built bombs that could erase a city in a blink, and we used them, not once but twice, and the world trembled, for in that moment we knew we had built the end, not just of war but of life itself. We held in our hands the power to erase our species, to make Earth silent forever." The student shivered as one, feathers, scales, shells, and skin all prickling with dread, for none among them had ever conceived of a weapon that could end not just armies but all. Yet here was a man who spoke of it as history already written, as something his people had lived through and survived. The human's voice grew softer now, almost breaking. He said, "That was the edge. That was when we saw our own extinction staring at us, not from a beast, not from a storm, but from ourselves. We had become the enemy. We had become the monster, and our wars were no longer battles between nations. They were battles against the survival of our own species." The professor lowered his head, his face hidden in shadow, his voice heavy. He whispered, "And yet you stand here. Human, your people stand. Somehow you turned away. Somehow you did not fall into silence." The human looked at him with steady eyes, and his answer was only a whisper. "We survived, but the wars of the past remain carved in us. They are the scars we carry, and they remind us always that the monster is never far." And with those words the hall sat frozen. No laughter, no disbelief, only silence thick enough to drown, for the story of the wars of the past was not a lesson of beasts. It was the lesson of a species that had almost devoured itself, and every alien in that room knew they would never forget what they had just heard. The room no longer felt like a place of learning. It felt instead like a tomb, heavy with ghosts that had been called from another world. The alien students sat with tense bodies, their eyes wide and unblinking. The professor himself stood stiff, as if turned to stone, and the human at the center of their attention did not raise his voice. He did not need to, for his words had become storms that filled every mind. The professor finally broke the silence with a voice that was rough. He said, "Human, you spoke of wars and weapons, yet you still call your kind the most dangerous extinct species. Explain to us, show us, why your people became worse than beasts, for beasts kill to live. But you claim that humans built monsters greater than themselves." The human nodded once, his eyes steady and dark, and he said, "Yes, Professor. We built monsters with our own hands. We built them from iron, from fire, from ideas that should never have lived. And once they were born, they grew beyond us. They became hungers we could no longer control." A murmur rippled across the hall. Wings rustled, scales scraped, shells clicked. The students leaned closer, afraid yet drawn to the story, for they sensed that what came next would show them not beasts of fur or fawn, but beasts made of thought and pride, and those were more terrifying than any creature of nature. The human began with the earliest of these monsters, he said. At first we shaped weapons that stretched beyond what a single man could hold, cannons that hurled stone and iron across fields, machines of wood and rope that could throw spears larger than a tree. And when we built them, we cheered. We thought ourselves clever. Yet each time we built such tools, our wars grew wider, our deaths grew greater, and the hunger of killing spread faster than we could measure. The alien students listened, their eyes reflecting fear, for in their world's tools were meant to build, not to destroy. The idea of shaping wood and iron not for shelter or food, but for the sole act of killing was bitter in their throats. Yet the human told it without pride, only with the weight of sorrow. He went on. We did not stop. We built ships of iron that floated on water, each one carrying cannons that could turn a city by the shore into rubble. We built machines with wheels and armor, rolling fortresses that spat fire again and again, and we built planes of steel that flew higher than the birds, dropping fire on those below. Entire cities turned to ash and nights lit brighter than day. The students shifted uneasily. Some turned their heads as if the pictures were too sharp, too violent, yet none left, for the pull of the tale was too strong, and the professor himself leaned forward, his scaled hands tightening as if gripping something unseen. The human's eyes grew darker as he continued. He said, "These were monsters of our own making, yet they were only the beginning, for in time we unlocked the atom, the smallest piece of matter, and inside it we found fire. Fire that could outshine the sun, fire that could burn not just a city, but the sky above it. We shaped bombs that carried this fire, and when they fell they turned earth to glass and shadows of men into scars on the ground. And in that moment we saw that we had built not just weapons, we had built our extinction with our own hands." A hiss of shock spread through the hall. The water-borne students pressed their palms against their chests. The feathered ones tucked their wings tight. The scaled ones whispered sharp breaths through their teeth, and still the human spoke, for his story was not finished. He said, "Those bombs were used only twice in war, yet their shadow never left us, for we built more, thousands more, each one able to end a city, each one able to erase millions, and nations filled their lands with them, ready to launch at a single word, ready to burn the world to ash in an hour. We lived for decades with that fire above our heads, knowing that one mistake, one anger, one leader's pride could end everything." The silence after those words was suffocating. The professor closed his eyes. The students looked at the human as if he were both fragile and terrifying, for they could not imagine living under such a shadow. And yet this human spoke of it as history lived and endured. But the human did not stop there. His voice carried on, softer now but more dreadful. He said, "Our monsters were not only bombs. We built poisons too, gas that burned lungs and blinded eyes, clouds that drifted over fields and left only silence. We built chemicals that withered crops so no one could eat, leaving children to starve while armies marched. And we even built sickness, diseases shaped in hidden rooms, not to heal but to kill. And in doing so we turned the smallest life into weapons. We turned the gift of knowledge into the curse of death. The students shivered as if cold swept through the hall. The idea of shaping poison, of twisting life itself, was beyond horror, yet the human spoke it as truth, and his eyes showed no delight, only the memory of a history too heavy to carry. He continued, and still the monsters grew. We built machines that thought faster than we could, machines that flew without pilots, machines that could fire without orders, and each step we told ourselves it was for protection. Yet each step made us weaker, more dependent, more at risk, for we had placed the choice of life and death into the hands of things we built, but could not always control. The professor opened his eyes again, his gaze sharp and uneasy. He asked, "Did your people not see, human? Did you not fear the monsters you built?" The human met his gaze with calm sorrow, and he answered, "We saw, but often too late. We feared, but not enough. For each time we built a monster we told ourselves it would keep us safe. We believed that fear would protect us, but fear only built more monsters, and so the cycle grew, until the earth groaned under their weight." The hall was still, the air heavy. The alien students no longer thought of the human as small or weak. They saw him now as a messenger, carrying shadows of a world that had nearly burned itself to nothing, and even the lights above seemed dimmer, as if they too feared the story. The human lowered his voice, almost whispering. He said, "The beasts of our world killed because they had to, but we killed because we could. We shaped monsters that no nature would ever birth, monsters born of mind, born of pride, and in the end we realized that the most dangerous extinct species was not the lion, not the serpent, not the bird of prey, but the human of the past, the human who built monsters with hands and mind and fed them with blood. That human is the one we buried, or at least we hope we did." The professor's scaled hand trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his robe. His voice came low, almost a growl, and he said, "Then the monsters you speak of were not beasts at all. They were shadows of yourselves, creations that lived only because you gave them life." The human nodded, his eyes still calm, and his answer was simple. "Yes, Professor. The worst monsters were not outside us. They were inside us. They were our own reflection, sharpened and unleashed. And though we call them extinct, though we claim to have buried them, the truth is they wait in memory, they wait in fear, and if we are not careful they will rise again." The hall had grown so heavy with silence that it seemed no sound would ever live there again. The students sat frozen in their seats, wings held tight, tails coiled, gills flaring slow, shells gleaming pale under the crystal light, and even the professor stood unmoving, as though carved from stone. The human's tale had carried them through storms of fire and ruin, through shadows of monsters born not of nature but of mind, and now they all waited to hear how such a species had survived, how such a fragile being still breathed after shaping its own destruction. The professor's voice broke the stillness at last, low and weighted with thought. He asked, "If your people built such monsters, if you walked so close to silence, how then do you sit here before us, human? How does your kind still walk the stars? What lesson saved you when all paths seemed to lead to your own end?" The human lifted his eyes, and for the first time a faint trace of light moved in them. Not joy, not pride, but something softer, something that carried both pain and hope. And he said, "We survived not because we were the strongest, not because we were the fastest, not because we were the cleverest. We survived because we learned, because we changed, because we chose to kill the monster inside ourselves before it killed everything outside." A murmur stirred among the students, uneasy and curious, for this was not the kind of answer they had expected. Many had thought the human would speak of some great weapon or a savior who came with power, yet he spoke instead of choice, of will, of learning, and that made them lean closer, their eyes fixed on him as he began to explain. He said, "When the bombs fell, when cities turned to ash, when the fire of the atom lit the sky, the world trembled, and for the first time in all of history we saw with clear eyes the truth. We saw that our wars had grown so vast that they no longer threatened only our enemies. They threatened us all. No nation could hide. No people could be safe. For the fire did not know friend from foe. And in that moment we faced a choice, change or die. And for once we chose to change. The feathered students shifted their wings slowly, as if the idea of choice carried weight on their feathers, for they had always believed that survival was decided by nature, by strength or speed. But here was a human saying survival came from thought, from will, and that shifted their understanding of what it meant to endure. The human continued. Our leaders came together, not in love, not in trust, but in fear. For fear was the one thing stronger than pride, and they made promises. Fragile at first, broken often, yet slowly they built something new. They signed pacts to limit the fire. They built lines of words instead of lines of soldiers. They began to speak across oceans instead of firing across them. And though war never vanished, though anger never died, we learned to keep the monster chained. The scaled students hissed softly, their tails curling tight, for their deserts had always been ruled by the strongest claw, by power taken, never shared. Yet here was a people who spoke of survival through fragile words, through promises that might break, and still they lived, and that unsettled them deeply. The human's voice grew heavier, and he said, but it was not only leaders who learned, it was the people too, the ones who had lost fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, the ones who had seen cities crumble and skies black with smoke. They carried the pain in their hearts, and they taught their children. They said never again. They said remember. They built books and schools. They built statues and graves. They kept the memory alive, so that we would never forget how close we had come to ending ourselves, and in that memory we found strength. The water-born students let out soft notes of song, mournful and deep, for they understood the power of memory carried through generations, yet even they could not imagine a memory as heavy as the one the human described, a memory of fire brighter than the sun and shadows burned into the earth. The human pressed on, his eyes calm yet sharp. He said, we also learned unity, not complete, not perfect, but enough, for in the face of a monster no nation could stand alone. The fire was too wide, the shadow too long, and so we built bonds across lands and seas, bonds that once would have been unthinkable. We built councils, we built groups of nations, we built ways to speak and share, and though those bonds often strained and often cracked, they held enough to keep the monster from rising. Again, the professor's scaled head tilted slowly, his eyes deep with thought, and he asked, so you claim that survival came from unity, from memory, from choice, not from strength? The human nodded, and his answer was soft but firm. Yes, Professor. We survived because we learned that no single hand could hold the fire, no single tribe could stop the monster. Only together could we bury it. Only together could we carry the weight of its shadow. And so together we chose to survive. The hall sat in silence again. But it was no longer the silence of fear alone. It was the silence of thought, of minds turning, of hearts weighing the words, for the lesson of survival was something they had never heard spoken this way, and it unsettled them as much as it inspired them. The human then lowered his voice further, almost a whisper, yet still it filled the hall. He said, but make no mistake, the monster did not die completely. It sleeps, it waits, and sometimes we hear its breath in the distance, in the anger of leaders, in the pride of nations, in the greed of power, and we remember that survival is not a gift given once. It is a choice made again and again, and if ever we forget, if ever we grow careless, the monster will rise, and then all we have built will burn. A shiver ran through the hall, for the warning was clear, and the alien students felt it not only as a tale of the past, but as a threat for the future, a truth that stretched beyond Earth, a truth that could one day reach their own worlds. The professor's voice was hushed when he spoke again. He said, then the lesson of your kind is not strength, but restraint, not pride, but humility, not hunger, but memory. The human bowed his head slightly, his eyes steady, and he said, yes, Professor. The lesson is that survival comes not from being the strongest predator, not from building the sharpest claw, but from knowing when to stop, when to turn away, when to say enough. And though we are far from perfect, though we stumble and fight and argue still, we carry that lesson with us, and it has kept us alive. The hall did not move for a long time after those words. It felt as though the very air was thinking, as though the walls themselves considered the meaning, and every student there knew. They had heard not only a story of humans, but a truth of life itself, a truth carved in fire and blood, a truth that would echo in their minds long after the class had ended. The hall remained heavy with silence, the words of the human still hanging in the air like smoke after fire. Every student sat frozen, minds racing with the lesson of survival, with the memory of fire that was not theirs yet still burned their thoughts, and for a long time none dared to speak. Even the professor stood quiet, his scaled hands folded as though he too feared to break the stillness. But then the human lifted his head, and when he spoke again his voice was calm, almost gentle, yet it carried a weight that pressed on every heart. He said, "Do not think the monster is gone. Do not believe it was destroyed. It sleeps inside us still, and if pushed too far, if threatened too deep, humans can wake it again." The words made the students shift uneasily, wings rustling, tails twitching, fins quivering, for they had been told of extinct beasts, of dangers of the past, but never had they been told that such a beast could still live inside the very ones who claimed to have slain it. And now they looked at the human with new fear. The human continued, "Our wars shaped us. They left scars that never healed. They made us clever. They made us stubborn. They made us dangerous. For every time we were struck down, we learned how to rise again. Every time we fell, we rose sharper, harder, stronger. And that lesson does not vanish. It is carved into us. It is part of us. And though we seek peace now, though we try to hold unity, we still carry the fire within." The professor's voice broke softly. "You speak as though your kind walks always with shadow at your side, as though the monster is your twin." The human nodded. "Yes, Professor. That is the truth. We are people of peace who remember war. We are builders who remember ruin. We are healers who remember wounds. And it is that memory that keeps us steady. But memory is fragile, and if it fades, the monster will not hesitate to rise." The insectoid students clattered their limbs nervously. They came from a world where hives fought bitter wars, but those wars had long passed into legend. Their people no longer understood blood or ruin, and they wondered in cold fear what it would mean if the human's warning proved true across the stars. The human's eyes moved slowly around the hall, meeting the gaze of each species, and he said, "You must understand, when humans walk among the stars, when we make friends, when we make allies, we bring not only our hope and our science and our music, we bring our shadow too. We bring the memory of what we once were, and if ever the galaxy pushes us too far, if ever it seeks to break us, then the monster will wake, and it will not care what world it burns." A murmur rippled through the hall like a wave through water, for the threat was not spoken with anger, not shouted with fury. It was whispered with calm certainty, and that calm made it more terrifying than any roar could have been. One student raised a trembling hand, a young one with silver scales that gleamed under the crystal lights, and asked, "If the monster is so close, if it can rise so quickly, then why should we trust your kind at all? Why should we not fear you as we would fear any great beast?" The human's gaze did not waver. He said, "Because fear alone would be the path to waking it, because suspicion alone would feed it. Trust is the chain that binds it. Friendship is the wall that holds it back. We survived because we learned to look at one another not as enemies, but as companions. And if the galaxy looks at us with only fear, if you drive us into shadow, then you will leave us no path but the old one." and none of us will survive that. The professor lowered his head, his thoughts deep and heavy, and the student sat in stunned silence, for the human's words rang with both threat and plea, warning and hope, and they could not tell if they should draw closer to such a being or step back in terror. The human continued, "We are not proud of what we were, but we do not hide it either. We carry it as a warning, as a lesson. We tell our children, we write our books, we build our monuments, not to honor the monster, but to remind ourselves that it still waits. And we hope that by remembering, by holding the memory tight, we will keep it sleeping." The avian students stretched their wings uneasily. They were a people of song and sky, and the thought of a species that sang with one wing while keeping a claw hidden in shadow disturbed them deeply. Yet they could not turn their eyes from the human, for his words rang with truth that could not be denied. The human's tone grew heavier still. "You ask about extinct species, Professor. You ask what beast shaped our world, and I tell you this. Our most dangerous extinct species is ourselves, but we are never free of it. It lingers in us, a ghost, a shadow, and the only way we survive is by remembering what we once were, by choosing again and again not to wake it. For if we ever forget, then extinction will not only be our story, it will be the story of every world we touch." A sharp stillness fell over the room, as though the very air held its breath, for the aliens understood now that this was not only a human tale, it was a warning meant for them all, a warning that survival was not a gift that came once. It was a choice that had to be made again and again, by every world, by every people. The professor spoke softly. "Then your warning is not only for us to fear you, it is for us to fear ourselves, to remember that any people can become the monster if they forget their own lessons." The human bowed his head slightly, his eyes shadowed but steady. "Yes, Professor, that is the truth. We humans may carry the clearest scar, but the monster can live in any heart, in any world, and if you believe it is only ours, then you risk waking your own." The hall shivered at those words, for the truth in them was sharp as a blade, and many students lowered their eyes, for each thought of their own world, their own wars, their own shadows, and wondered if the monster waited for them too. The human leaned back at last, his voice calm but echoing with weight. He said, "We are survivors not because we are strong, but because we learned that strength alone is never enough. We are survivors because we remember, because we choose, and because we know that peace is not weakness. It is the only chain strong enough to hold the monster." The professor's scaled hands trembled slightly as he lifted his notes, and said in a voice both hushed and full of awe, "Then your lesson is not only of survival but of warning, a warning not to forget, a warning to every world, a warning to the future." The words had ended, yet the echo of them lived on inside the hall like a low thunder that refused to fade. The students sat in their seats unmoving, each one locked inside their own storm of thought, eyes cast down or wide with fear, wings folded tight, shells trembling, scales glittering under the pale crystal light, and though no sound came from their mouths, the silence itself spoke louder than any roar. The professor stood behind his desk, his hands still clutching the smooth stone of his lectern, his face grave and shadowed, his breath shallow, for he too had felt the weight of the human's words, and it seemed to him that all the long years of his teaching had never brought a moment like this, never had a single answer carved so deep into the hearts of so many, never had a lesson cut through the illusions of safety and peace with such sharpness. The human did not move either. He sat calm and still, his gaze steady, his face without pride, without triumph, without anger, and yet the stillness of his form carried a power that no movement could match. It was the stillness of a being who had carried the shadow of his people for generations, a shadow that he did not need to raise his voice to make known, for it was already alive in the eyes of those who looked at him. Slowly the murmur began, soft as the stir of leaves in distant wind, a whisper among the alien students, questions half-spoken, fears shared under breath, and each whisper carried the same meaning, a new vision of humanity, a vision that no longer saw them as fragile, no longer as weak, but as something far more unsettling, as a species that had survived its own end and walked still carrying the ashes of that survival. One avian student leaned close to another, her feathers trembling, and she whispered, "If they have slain their own monster once, what else might they slay if pressed?" And her companion gave no answer, for none could be found. A scaled student muttered to his neighbor, "They speak of peace, yet they carry war inside. They speak of unity, yet they hold fire chained. What kind of people can live like this?" And his neighbor only curled his tail tighter, eyes fixed on the human with a mixture of dread and awe. The professor raised one hand, and the murmurs fell away again, silence returning, heavier than before, and in that silence he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Today you have all heard a truth greater than the lesson I planned. You asked of extinct species, of the beasts that once ruled our worlds, and you have been given an answer that is not only about one world but about all worlds, an answer that shows us what it means to walk close to the edge of extinction and yet step back. And though the answer came from a human, it is not only their truth, it is a truth that must live in all of us." The students bowed their heads, some in respect, some in fear, some in deep confusion, for the professor's words only deepened the weight that already pressed on them. The human at last shifted, leaning forward slightly, and he spoke again, his voice soft, almost a whisper, but every ear caught it, every heart felt it. He said, "Remember this day, not for me, not for humans, but for yourselves. Remember that peace is not the nature of any species. It is a choice. It is a wall built stone by stone, word by word. And if you ever believe that you are beyond war, if you ever believe the monster cannot live in you, then you have already begun to wake it." A shiver passed through the hall, as if an unseen wind had moved, for the words struck not only their minds, but their very bones, a truth so heavy it seemed to bend the air itself. The professor bowed his head slowly, and he said, "Then humanity's greatest extinct species is not gone at all. It lives as a shadow, waiting, and what you have given us today is not only knowledge but warning, and for that I thank you, though my thanks carries with it the weight of fear." The human did not smile, did not nod. He only lowered his gaze once more, calm and steady, and in that quiet gesture the class felt more than any speech. They felt that the warning was not only words but life, that this being carried it always, carried it in silence, in patience, in memory, and that made the lesson eternal. The crystal lights above flickered faintly as though even the room itself bowed under the gravity of the moment, and when the professor finally dismissed the class, no one rose quickly, no one rushed to speak, no one laughed as they so often did at the end of lessons. Instead, they rose slowly, carefully, as though afraid that even their footsteps might wake the shadow of the human had spoken of. In the corridors of the academy the whispers spread, each student carrying the story like fire in dry grass, each voice telling another. The humans said their most dangerous extinct species was themselves, and they almost died by their own hand, and they survived not by strength, but by memory, not by power, but by choice, and now they walk with us among the stars. By nightfall the story had reached halls far beyond its single classroom. It passed between species who had never before thought of humans as anything more than fragile wanderers. It carried to scholars, to leaders, to guards, and with each telling the silence that had filled that room seemed to grow larger, to press further into the academy's heart. Some spoke of fear, saying, "If they carry such a shadow, if they hide such a monster, how can they be trusted among us? How can they be allowed to walk our worlds?" Others spoke of respect, saying, "They have faced what none of us has faced. They have walked to the edge of their own destruction and turned back. They have slain a beast of their own making. Who else could claim such a victory?" And a few spoke with wonder, saying, "Perhaps the human warning is not a threat but a gift of memory, a gift of caution. For if we listen, if we learn, we may avoid our own monsters before they rise." The professor sat alone in his chamber that night, his notes before him, yet he could not write. His hands trembled as he thought again of the human's calm face, the steady voice, the weight of words spoken without anger, without pride, only truth, and he knew that he had witnessed something that would mark the academy forever. And the human, alone in his quarters, sat quietly as well, his gaze fixed on the stars outside his window, and though no one else could hear, he whispered to himself words older than the academy, older than the journey to the stars, words carried from his ancestors. Never forget, never again, for the monster sleeps, but it never dies, and it waits for those who grow careless. The silence of the hall had followed him even there, into his chamber, into the night, and it would follow the students too, for silence was the true answer, silence filled with thought, silence filled with warning, silence filled with the knowledge that humanity's greatest extinct species was not beast nor machine, but human itself, and that silence would never leave them. And so the lesson ended not with applause, not with laughter, not with debate, but with silence, a silence that spread across the academy, across the minds of every student who had sat in that hall, a silence that carried a weight heavier than any word, a silence that told them they had seen not only knowledge but truth, not only history but future, not only the human but themselves.